Welcome to this 19th edition of the International Conference on Quality in Education, dedicated to the theme of digital transformation of educational systems at the service of quality and equity. I am pleased to welcome four great speakers: Frederic Fauvet from Canada, Regis Mallet from France, Elsa Kron from United Kingdom. Nous allons commencer avec Monsieur Régis Mallet. Donc, à vous la parole, Monsieur Mallet.
Merci beaucoup. Good morning, good evening. Sorry, good evening, everyone. Thank you for your invitation. You gave me the possibility to present in English or in French. And as the purpose of this is to discuss the interaction between education, globalization, and languages in the framework of hybrid educational devices, I will try it in both languages. So the first slide, I will talk about hybridization of education from the point of view of a researcher in comparative education and a teacher educator who also leads a bilingual international master's degree in teacher education. On the condition that they are supported by appropriate mediations, hybrid education schemes combining face-to-face and distance learning can provide educators with reflective tools, knowledge, and know-how that accompany them crucially in their educational path and their professional development. The design of an international plurilingual master program, which was set up 5 years ago and which has graduated now more than 100 students, from all continents, is part of a long-term reflection process between disciplines within the framework of a graduate school of education in France, the University of Bordeaux. The relationships between disciplines, concepts and languages, education and research, initial and continuing education, local settings and global meaning, face-to-face and distant learning, are key questions for the implementation of such a master degree in education, which is conducive to working on the links between disciplines, spaces, and languages in the education of teachers in a globalized world. Let's keep in mind first that our schools are mostly monolingual, and yet they prepare our students for a world that is multilingual and pluricultural. This is not new information, but the myth of Babel has a hard skin. The double ambition of hybridization in education and accompanying the cultural and linguistic mobility of students, teachers, and educators is a democratic and social challenge. Indeed, the limitation of intercultural mobility to a globalized elite has contributed to deepen the fragmentation of our educational systems and of our societies. A large part of youth, indeed, in fact, the most socially and economically disadvantaged, benefit very little from this ambition. And this also concerns the teaching world, which was built on a national soil and which is, as a whole, still only weakly connected to foreign educational worlds. Numbers of studies have shown how accessibility to mobility remains socially selective due to persistent determinisms, characterized in particular by migratory competencies and digital competencies that are unequally shared. In a context of increasing polarization of youth, international mobility and digital education is at the heart of European strategies. Therefore, the development of courses marked by multilingual openness in hybrid formats, accessible to students destined to teaching as a profession, is crucial. Cultural mobility, whether concrete, virtual, or hybrid, can be an effective resource for meeting the challenges related to ethical concerns, about the recognition of the other, intercultural collaboration, and transversal competencies in education and teaching. First, it allows the acquisition of intercultural competencies, the integration of an international learning experience by varying intercultural situations to support open-mindedness and critical thinking. Second, the notion of digital turn in education invites us to rethink the learning process in line with the global transformation of society and the knowledge economy. It challenges the verticality of teaching, the concept of knowledge sharing, and promotes cooperation in the production of knowledge. And finally, it is equally important to recognize plurilingualism in educational spaces, not reinforcing the global trend of exclusively Anglo-centric language options. On the contrary, promoting and supporting bilingual programs allow students and teachers to practice several languages as part of their education, and this constitutes an added value in terms of personal development and open-mindedness and cultural, multicultural know-how. Je vais poursuivre à présent en français, comme annoncé, pour présenter justement les particularités de ce programme de master plurilingue, associant à la fois les sciences de l'éducation comparée et les langues et cultures. Il a la particularité d'accueillir des étudiants francophones et anglophones dans le cadre d'un dispositif de formation hybride, c'est-à-dire à la fois marqué par des moments de rassemblement en présence, des semaines de rassemblement, et puis, de manière assez importante, des sessions à distance, des forums, des interventions à distance d'une équipe éducative qui est d'ailleurs elle-même multiculturelle et multilingue. Donc il y a là une dimension à la fois originale, qui est justement de ne pas sacrifier en quelque sorte la francophonie sur l'autel de la lingua franca qu'est l'anglais, mais en même temps de ne pas non plus composer un village gaulois autour des questions d'éducation à l'international. Donc c'est un pari, mais c'est quelque chose qui fait sens, en particulier pour des étudiants à la fois francophones, bien sûr, mais aussi anglophones qui ont un goût justement pour les deux langues. Donc c'est quelque chose qui est parfaitement cohérent et qui rencontre les intérêts de beaucoup à la fois d'étudiants, d'enseignants en devenir et d'enseignants chevronnés qui ont en fait, qui partagent comme expérience une dimension fédérative extrêmement forte qui est celle d'intervenir le plus souvent en contexte éducatif, interculturel et plurilingue. Alors ça concerne à la fois des étudiants français à l'étranger, soit dans des établissements étrangers, soit dans des établissements français à l'étranger, mais aussi des enseignants anglophones. Quand je dis anglophone, ça ne veut pas dire anglo-saxon, ça veut dire anglophone. Ça peut être des étudiants chinois, ça peut être des étudiants européens d'autres pays que ceux qui composent la francophonie européenne, des étudiants africains, bref, américains bien entendu, qui sont particulièrement intéressés par l'originalité de ce format. Donc des publics pluriels, alors des éducateurs, des enseignants au sens large, ce sont des personnes qui interviennent majoritairement en contexte scolaire, mais pas seulement. On trouve qu'il y a aussi un grand intérêt à accueillir des enseignants qui interviennent dans d'autres environnements, y compris la formation des adultes ou l'éducation informelle. Et la particularité, c'est qu'on met en dialogue dans ce cadre à la fois les sciences de l'éducation, les sciences du langage, les langues et cultures, et en particulier évidemment la langue anglophone, ce qui nous permet de travailler aussi sur les objets et sur les savoirs eux-mêmes en discussion autour précisément des médiations linguistiques, sémiotiques que leur circulation opère par définition. Donc il y a là des enjeux intéressants que nous développons également à travers des formes pédagogiques que nous essayons de penser sur un mode à la fois très varié et très adapté à ce que nous ambitionnons. C'est-à-dire que nous plaçons la question de la coopération au cœur véritablement du programme de formation, du dispositif de formation, à la fois en sollicitant les groupes nous composons des groupes souvent plurilingues. D'ailleurs, on évite de composer justement des petits villages affinitaires, mais précisément de composer des groupes qui auront à produire ensemble des savoirs, et y compris dans les productions individuelles qui sont, disons, également importantes. Nous composons quelque chose qui est classique dans la formation des adultes, des tandems, voire des trios composés d'amis critiques qui accompagnent précisément à l'élaboration des productions, notamment c'est le cas pour les mémoires individuelles. Et la particularité également, bien sûr, c'est que les langues sont envisagées non seulement comme un outil de communication, de passation des contenus, en circulant de l'une à l'autre, comme j'essaie de le faire là, sans contrainte, en quelque sorte. Ça fait partie du contrat. On est dans une logique de French and English friendly, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas de figures imposées. Mais par contre, évidemment, ça suppose une compréhension réciproque. Et lorsqu'on écrit, par exemple, un mémoire en anglais, on est plutôt invité à le défendre, à le soutenir en français, et vice-versa. De la même manière que les productions collectives peuvent être plurilingues et sont invités aussi à réfléchir aux enjeux linguistiques, sémiotiques, de traduction au sens littéral et au sens qui a été construit notamment par Latour, mais qui renvoie finalement à l'idée de construire des communautés de sens sur la base de délibération autour des objets de savoir. Du coup, c'est quelque chose qui est tout à fait intéressant, parce que ça permet de développer sur des bases à la fois, encore une fois, de rassemblement, parce que pour faire groupe, malgré tout, dans un dispositif de formation qualifiant hybride, il est important de ponctuer la formation par des moments de rassemblement, pour que les gens se connaissent aussi in vivo, et qu'il y ait aussi des moments de convivialité qui échappent simplement au moment de travail en groupe ou en groupe, ou bien tout simplement l'ensemble de la promotion. Et tout cela vise finalement le développement de compétences à la fois culturelles, linguistiques, mais aussi d'accompagnement. On voit bien qu'il y a une mise en abîme en quelque sorte dans les modalités avec l'objet même de la formation, qui est de former des formateurs et de former des enseignants, et qui donc accompagnent soit l'insertion, soit le développement professionnel, voilà, navigation professionnelle, comme on dit, dans le secteur de l'éducation et de la formation. Alors, to conclude on this, please let me emphasize 3 points I would like to stress. First, the intercultural and plurilingual approach allows us to recognize semiotic variations in the construction of education in context, and to educate, to form active critical citizens, students and teachers. And this supports the different needs of learning and recognition, developing the transversal competencies of educators. Second, I also wish to emphasize the conception of education that is at work here, which is very close to what the German tradition identifies with the term of Bildung, in the sense of ethical, professional, and personal development of educators in the matter, quite clearly oriented towards education for citizenship, global citizenship, inspired by concept of equity, justice, and solidarity. In this humanistic and pluralist ecology of education, deliberation, as I said, and cooperation occupy a central place, which distinguishes it from an economistic conception focused on human capital and people adaptability to economic needs, period. This is a necessary inflection, to my view, to face the challenges related to individual and collective responsibilities and the necessary solidarity between territories and human people. If becoming a citizen means sharing certain cardinal values such as human rights, recognition of cultural diversity, the quest for equity, then education and teacher educators have somehow to reflect these convictions and values in the conception of education at work. Third, and finally, this conception of a democratic and deliberative education is relevant in a period of political instability and rising extremisms in various regions of the world, including Europe, torn between a sense of loss of identity and economic globalization. These turbulent times, like the trial generated by the crisis, of course, of COVID-19, lead to an awareness of the crucial role of education and the promotion of transmission and sharing of democratic values in the construction of inclusive societies. The ambition implies taking into account the advances as well as the difficulties and regression in certain educational and social contexts in order to better prepare young people and their teachers who accompany them to prepare them for debates, controversies, critical citizenship and democratic vigilance in a national context where there is a growing attraction, including among the younger generations, for radicalism or extremism. Public education and public institutions obviously have a role to play in this sense. The role of the teacher has an intellectual inaction somehow is crucial into this idea of restoring a commitment, a collective commitment to progressive values and action. In brief, the promotion of concepts of global citizenship education in and through languages aspires to create a new Bildung that promotes a model of dialogical, deliberative democracy with a view to cooperative development. As it has been posted for a long time by UNESCO, this intends to recognize the function and mission of teachers, as I said, as intellectuals in action, able to create the conditions necessary for the flourishing of deliberative democracy, which is, of course, endangered by the rise of what are now called illiberal democracies. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Régis, pour cette intéressante intervention qui met l'accent sur l'importance du développement de compétences linguistiques et culturelles dans la promotion d'engagement professionnel et citoyen. Merci encore. Now, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Frédéric Fauvet from Canada, but who is currently in Australia with time difference of 10 hours.
I'm now not muted anymore. Do I share my own slides? Is that what you'd like me to do?
Please share it if you want.
Give me just 1 minute. Okay, I got a minute. I have to close them first. Is the sound okay? I was slightly worried about the technology. You can hear me okay?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, thanks. So, because I'm very far away in the middle of the night and I wasn't sure if the technology was going to be with us. So it's just loading up now, if you give me 1 minute.
It's okay.
Okay, there we go. You can see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So today I'm going to talk to you about key social justice lessons that we've learned from the COVID pivot. And we are notably going to look at ensuring accessibility and inclusion. Those are going to be two of the main focus that I use as a lens for this, and see whether they can remain, looking towards the future, remain at the heart of digital transformation of educational spaces in post-pandemic landscapes. Everything is cut out for me, but you're all good. I'm sure you've put yourself on mute. So I'm just going to acknowledge that I am normally working on the unceded and traditional territories of the Silix people. The objectives today, we're going to look at the disruption that COVID has created in the K-12 sector, gauge the impact of the disruption on inclusion and social justice work, consider the details and gains of this perturbation, examine now how we can move forward and learn from those lessons, and ponder a word of caution about management of change, just as how easy is it going to be to then take those lessons into the work that we do. I'm slightly worried because all sound is cut out. Can someone just let me know that I'm still good and nothing is interrupted? Because it sounds like I'm just logged off now.
We can hear you really well.
Oh, super. Okay, thank you. Everyone's on mute. Super. Okay, so just a quick just chat about myself and the methodological lens that I use here. So I'm a scholar, practitioner, consultant in the field of inclusion and social justice, particularly universal design for learning, both in the K-12 and the post-secondary sector. Much of the work featured here emerges from qualitative work, which wasn't specifically designed for the COVID sort of pivot, but they're all studies that were started before COVID and then carried on during COVID. And so inadvertently, I ended up collecting a lot of data on teachers' perceptions of what was going on, even if that was not directly the focus of all of these three studies that I had already started. And particularly since this was qualitative and often this was semi-directive interviews going on, teachers started sharing, and most participants were teachers, started sharing about some of the difficulties they were experiencing, and which gave me an insight into some of the issues we were having with accessibility, inclusion, and social justice. So as you know, a major transformation. It has been one of the largest transformation or disruption to the K-12 sector, I would say in the last 6 years, certainly since the Second World War. It has been profound, and I'm going to, obviously we can't be fully interactive, but ask you to take a few seconds to think of all the things that have changed in the way we do our work within the K-12 sector. It has been fundamental, and I think we're only starting to see the tip of the iceberg in terms of what impact it has had. We're very quick, and I will argue this, to go back to normal and business as usual. But we do have to take the time to actually gauge what an impact this has had. So in practice, the changes obviously have been different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, just as the pivot itself has been different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But at least one or several instances of fully online pivot have occurred. Sporadic partial online pivots, so people going back to an online teaching, ongoing experimentation with hybrid delivery and assessment that's still going on, a rise in school dropout numbers, and this we're not gauging yet, is how many students just did not come back. Absenteeism rates that remain extremely high worldwide, and they've not been thoroughly explored. We assume that these are, the children with anti-vaxxers. We assume these are children that are worried about health. We're not quite sure, and those rates are quite scary. Unprecedented degree of parental ambivalence. I don't think we've seen this again for the last 60 years. Parents who are now starting to doubt the benefits of face-to-face education, and a great uncertainty as to how we are going to move forward and how we are going to integrate some of that. Very recently I was at a large training for pre-service teachers where teachers were asking, but what if students never want to come back to school? What if I have to create accessible and inclusive provisions for students who are not even in the room? So this shows really that there are, there's what has appeared in the last 2.5 years is that really there's been cracks in policy and practice. So despite, I would say, first a wide body on scholarship on school preparedness, which mostly comes from context of post-conflict, but we have integrated this into the Western sort of literature on preparedness. Little of this has actually occurred in the field. Social justice and inclusion have immediately become something that we've dismissed. They've been put on the back burner because we've argued about this contingency teaching. Contingency teaching usually being seen as an emergency procedure, and we've tended to waive everything else. In many jurisdictions, more specifically, legislative and legal requirements for inclusion have actually been set aside. So even in Canada, our Charter for Rights and Freedom actually has a clause which is called the undue hardship, which argues that if for any reason a school or a post-secondary institution is unable to fulfill those human rights obligations, that is fine, as long as there's an overriding urgency. And this has been used, unfortunately, several times during this pandemic. So they have also been breaches of human rights, severe breaches of human rights. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if you're interested, look up the media around the proctoring, the online proctoring services that have been used during the pandemic, particularly in the college and post-secondary sector, created huge breaches of human rights, which are now, moving on towards human rights tribunal. More widely, there's been a lack of concern and of an awareness about inclusion, social justice, and equity, and this is understandable. Most people have gone into this sort of survival mode, focused back on their family unit, often in lockdown, often with very little communication with others, and often very worried about financial and employment imperatives, which have depleted our pro-social choices and the attention that we pay to others. Sometimes the danger has been inconspicuous, and I'm particularly keen to create awareness around things like the learning part. So for those of you who are not aware what the learning part, it's a tendency that has happened around the world, but mostly in North America and Europe, where during the lockdown, when we were supposed to stay at home and have bubbles, usually of no more than 6, certain middle-class parents have actually got together and said, well, we can create a bubble here, and we can create a unit of families where 6 kids actually are studying together. Originally the intentions were good, right? Release 5 parents when one parent could take on the role and then switch that role. But very quickly in those setups, we've seen actually tutors being hired for that little bubble and those 6 students. So really what we've created inherently is mini schools that were financed and paid by the parents themselves. Now, the problem about learning part, I've got a chapter out on this, is that it's been underreported in the press. And what we've seen is that the learning part has been specifically white and middle class. It excluded students that are racialized, excluded students with disabilities, excluded all sorts of diverse learners who have not access to this. And it has been sort of accepted by school as being, a normal occurrence in that landscape. So a lot of, basically to summarize, a lot of social justice issues and concerns, some that we're not even aware of yet and that are underreported. And that's my main takeaway for this. So just how bad has it been? We're going to try in the second section to look at the actual impact. So we said it's been concerning, it's been worrying. There's some great breaches of social justice, equity, and accessibility, but how worrying has it been? If we look at the detail, the picture actually has perhaps been a bit more dichotomous than we think. And I started working on this in the last year and really starting to be able to pull sometimes very large room of professional development sessions, etc., sometimes with 100 people. And what we see, this is a typical one. This was a small group, but it's very typical of what I'm seeing is if you ask people, has the pandemic actually been detrimental for social justice and inclusion, or has it actually been beneficial? Here we have a 7-11 split. Usually in large rooms, I've done this in rooms of 200, we actually landed a pretty much 50-50% split. And I think I'm going to ask you to pause and think, isn't that strange? How many times in again, last century of education, and we've been at a point where the lived experience of people has been entirely polarized. Half of it thinking this has been great and half of it thinking this has actually been disastrous. These are some of the lessons that are going to be hard to move forward if we don't even agree on what the effect has been. How can we effectively include these lessons into the way we look at online learning, hybrid learning, and also face-to-face learning that integrates this lesson? I'm going to go through the slides quickly, but I'm sure the slides will be available to you. Again, just to identify how this landscape has been dichotomous, and there are 2 slides on which there are both detriments and benefits. I wanted to do that instead of doing just the benefits and just the detriments. So on the first ones, the great benefit is that educators have globally embraced their role as designers of learning experience. When I do work in inclusive design, most teachers so far until 2019 were saying, I don't design. I deliver curriculum. I don't design. What are you talking to me about? Why do you talk to me about inclusive design? This has changed overnight. Overnight, during the pivot, we actually have K-12 teachers and post-secondary educators who have suddenly realized I am a designer, and the choices I make in terms of design have an immediate impact on the accessibility and inclusion of diverse learners. So suddenly we've had a huge eureka moment in the teaching profession who now actually understand most of these lessons were learned through bad design, bad decisions overnight, which translated into disastrous teaching and learning the next day. But teachers have now had that sort of just-in-time feedback that when they do something extremely problematic, it has an immediate impact on the learning experience. So educators generally are more receptive to inclusive design, and they are also more widely shared resources. This has been a collective experience, so lots of people have been sharing about this, and there's a really great interest at the moment about sharing resources, doing things better, learning better. So great window of opportunity there, but there's also been some hurdles. The discourse on inclusion has been very diluted. Sometimes people have been doing things and saying, I'm doing an inclusive reflection, and they were not. They're actually just working their way through contingency teaching again and trying to problem solve and put out fires, but that was not a reflection around inclusion. Also been some great confusion around inclusive strategies and technology. A lot of people working on the inclusion of technology and saying, I'm working on accessibility and inclusion, social justice. They were not. As we know, they're two different things. Yes, technology can be a great affordance for all the work that we do in accessibility, social justice, and inclusion, but there is not an ability to substitute one for the other. Also, the reflection around social justice has actually been fragmented, not homogeneous, and not every aspect of what we do, and that equitable approach has been the focus. What we've seen mostly is a lot of reflection around the accessibility of the information that we give to students. So accessibility, inclusion in how we present information, but we've looked very little at the engagement and the voice of learners and the accessibility and inclusion in those respects. Just a few more points to finish. And the benefits, don't forget that we have not been able to move, but there's been an incredible sharing of know-how because we have done events like this. In 2021, I gave 13 keynotes. I would never have been able to travel around the world and do that. So suddenly we have exponentially shared knowledge around the world about accessibility and inclusion and inclusive mindset. And also there's an understanding that, and it's again a collective understanding, you get this when you pull any kind of room or any kind of group, that we have to learn lessons from this pivot and take it back into our face-to-face teaching now. So that's been great. But there's also been very little contact between support services and teachers. That's been really problematic. Both sides have been overwhelmed, have not had time to talk. So often that reflection on accessibility has been insular. It's just been the teacher with no contact with anyone else. No opportunities for those water cooler moments, right? So that networking, that social capital that happens when people talk about their practice. We haven't had any of that. Educators are more receptive than ever, but they also burnt out, right? COVID exhaustion does exist. And there's also been very sporadic but very well documented issues of, crisis of human rights breach, as I've said, and that's problematic in trying to say that the landscape could have been positive overall. So assessment here is that we've refined, right? We started saying it's been an incredible disruption to K-12 landscape. Now we can actually say it has been a really dichotomous experience for the K-12 landscape. And this is where we left at, with some great things happening and some really, really concerning things happening. So how will we move forward, and how can we, learn the lessons from this and move forward? And this is really the key of this conference. This is how it connects back to the general theme. How can we create digital futures for our schools if we haven't learned from these 2 years of exceptional disruption, and we're left with that sort of aftertaste where what sometimes it was good, sometimes it was actually disastrous. So what do we do now in terms of educational institutions and sectors, and even as individuals, to document these mistakes, and how do we integrate the successes as well? So this really is this talk is a call for action. I would argue that there's really an urgent need to pause and first of all document the mistakes we've done. We've been very quick to move forward and say it's business as usual. We're back to normal, right? Back to normalcy. And people are eager. There's a really great thirst to forget about all the things that have happened. It's important to rectify the wrong. So there have been breaches. There have been people who've been, who have been abandoned, dismissed by the system. Their needs have not been met. We can't just move forward and accept that for a generation, outcomes will just been bad because they did not have access to the required, social justice measures, equitable measures, accessible measures, etc. We should therefore reject proactively the notion that schools have just gone back to normal. I would argue, and I keep arguing this, that they have been more shaken than ever been in 60 years. So it's a great there's a great issue of wishful thinking if we're just saying, oh, we're now back to what we were before. First of all, the picture in 2019 in terms of inclusion accessibility wasn't great. So going back to that isn't necessarily the desired outcome. We want to learn from these mistakes and learn from the opportunities, which have also been radical, and be able to move forward and create new digital futures, new inclusive and accessible futures that incorporate a lot of the opportunities and flexibility that we've had in the last 2 years. We need to record that impact that I've said on teacher mindset. you know, if I weigh my words because this is what I do, if this is the first time in the last 60 years that we have teachers who are receptive to that work, receptive to inclusion, receptive to inclusive design, receptive to work on accessibility in this new landscape, new spaces, let's grab this and let's actually produce scholarship that actually builds and optimizes and maximizes that opportunity. Lastly, also make school preparedness a reality. As I said, the literature is there. It does actually include a lot of reflection around accessibility and inclusion and social justice, but that has remained very conceptual. Again, it emerges from a lot of the work that's done in the global south around post-conflict landscapes. We actually have been very dismissive in the 20th century and 21st century in the global north to say we won't need this. It's there, but we don't need it. We have seen that we actually need it. That school preparedness needs to dribble down to every teacher, every school leader, so that we can actually think about who should not be left behind as we prepare for the next issue. And that might be another pandemic, another global event. I would argue that the world, again, has never been as disruptive as it is now. And that's been pointed out by my colleague. Therefore, we have to prepare for the fact that other disruptions will again come and transform our schools. And this time we want to make sure that we are prepared and those lessons have been put to the forefront. Now, my last word of caution as I finish is that schools and educational sectors are not optimal in addressing management of change effectively. And this has nothing to do with COVID. It's always been the case, I would argue. Beyond this, any organization always has a problem with going back to a status quo, even if that status quo is dysfunctional. We know this from systemic theory. Even if a system is completely warped, if you shake it up, the first instinct is for that system to go back to where it was, even if it actually is not. It's a toxic position. It's not a great position. So we have to integrate all this knowledge, all this scholarship from organizational psychology, and think, how do we now continue to build on that disruption intentionally, proactively, and effectively? And is it occurring currently in all of our sectors? I would argue that it's not, but we all have the responsibility to become change agents and to build on those lessons and actually challenge and query the system so that they do not forget what has happened and can learn from that and grow from that. So I'm going to leave you with a general question for all of the participants, but what will you do in each of your sectors to keep that dialogue alive? How will you gauge whether an authentic reflection has been integrated into practice? So everything that we've learned in the last 2 years, are there practical ways in your environments that leads it to be integrated and really to shape the way we now teach and approach the needs of learners, particularly in terms of social justice, inclusion, accessibility? And how do we move from disruption to business as usual without erasing those lessons? This is an individual responsibility, I think, that we all have. And that's what I will leave you with, that reflection and the need to take this back to your own environment. And I think we take questions at the end, and you've got a couple of references there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frederick Fouvet, for your interesting presentation, which focuses on schools and the educational sector are not optimally effective in addressing management of change effectively, and there are rich lessons to be learned and integrated from the COVID course into our practice and policies around inclusion and social justice. Thank you again. And now I am pleased to welcome Dr. Ilsa Kron from United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks very much to those excellent speakers. I'm just going to try to share my screen. Hopefully that is now working, I think. And hopefully I'll be able to move the slides on, which will also be nice. Thanks very much to those excellent speakers. That was really thought-provoking. I'm going to talk to you about the experience of UK higher education, so the university sector within the UK. And I'm going to have two focal points to my presentation. I'm going to talk about the impact of this move to digital and hybrid delivery, the impact of that on quality processes, and also the impact on pedagogy and the student learning experience. And that is, again, within the university sector, just to emphasise. So first, to think a little bit about quality processes, we have a number of established quality processes, and those are just as applicable to activity in the digital space. So things like annual monitoring, periodic review. We have a range of reference points that we make use of. I've identified some of the reference points that are commonly used within the UK, like our quality code. And we will also make use of feedback, the feedback from your students, from external examiners, and from professional statutory regulatory bodies. Bless you. And you may also engage with internal to your institution discussion groups, so whatever those may be, your staff student liaison groups, programme committees, and so on. And crucially, and just as one of the colleague who was speaking before me, Frederick, was talking about the importance of there being a good tie-up between professional service colleagues and the teachers, the academic staff, delivering and assessing activity, then it's crucially important that we should engage with professional services, particularly when we're delivering and assessing in a digital or in a hybrid space. So there's that raft of regular processes, but the pandemic raised a number of questions about our regular practices, and I've identified a couple of key questions here. First and foremost was, is it a good idea just to carry on with what we knew before, carry on with those established processes for evaluating what we were doing, or were there special measures that we really needed to put in place to capture what we needed to know about how students were experiencing their education during the pandemic? And that is a question, I think, that continues to prevail as we're continuing to seek ways of building on what we've learned and building on what we know is the positive practice around digital and blended delivery. So some examples of practice in terms of quality processes that we saw. The first one was very particular to the pandemic. We saw a number of institutions who thought, well, we're going to pause our periodic reviewing activity, but we're going to place even greater emphasis on our annual monitoring. And for those institutions that maybe didn't necessarily engage in a formal annual monitoring exercise for each of their programmes, many of them introduced that in lieu of that more of a sort of periodic and reflective focus. They were really engaged in what was happening within the year in terms of student experience, in terms of progression, and so on. A number of very many institutions, if not just about all of them, introduced additional measures for gathering student opinion, and particularly to gather sort of on the hoof or opinion from students, so pulse surveys and very quick ways of gathering a view on how students were experiencing their education at the time of the pandemic. And that is something that I think can continue, is thinking about how we can use these quick methods of gaining student opinion in order to quickly inform what comes next. And that's perhaps a particular feature when we're delivering in a digital or indeed a hybrid space. It was really important for providers to put in place support for programme leaders and those organising courses. That took a variety of forms. For example, some institutions created whole frameworks for moving online and to identify some of the design rules, or sometimes described as minimum expectations, which I think was perhaps acceptable during an emergency provision, but which we would now want to move into thinking about, well, let's develop a framework of good practice. What is it? Let's design in the knowledge that our students will be learning in either wholly in a digital space, or will be learning partly in a digital and partly in an in-person environment. And a number of institutions, because certainly as far as the UK was concerned, the point at which our initial lockdowns occurred meant that in that first year of the pandemic for us, what was most affected were in higher education were students' assessments. So it kicked in at the point, so assessment was disrupted, and it looked as though we weren't going to be able to carry out assessments, or certainly not as many assessments in the format that was traditionally intended. so large exam rooms with lots of students mixing and physically being in a space together and working for 3 hours or so on an examination paper. That just wasn't possible during the pandemic times, and so there had to be emergency measures for a lot of program leaders were looking at how learning outcomes could still be demonstrated, or how the meeting of learning outcomes could be demonstrated even if they were being assessed differently. They were looking at also at ensuring that program level learning outcomes were achieved even if individual constituent parts of the program, so all of the learning outcomes relating to all of the individual modules, may have been assessed in more umbrella or holistic manners compared to what we might think of as the before times, the times in advance of the times before the pandemic. And because of that shift in alignment of learning outcomes, a number of providers began to think about, perhaps we have been over-assessing in advance. Actually, perhaps, although the shift was prompted by an emergency position, actually maybe there were some benefits there, and maybe we need to look at reapproving our programs in order to deliver them and continue delivering them in an online or in a blended format, and particularly to think about assessment and being carried out in that changed way. So we think about a number of challenges and difficulties for evaluation of programmes, but actually there were also quite a lot of positives as well. We heard a lot of examples of students finding increased opportunities to engage in quality activity, particularly if there were those student-staff liaison meetings, or if students were invited to engage in discussions around programme evaluation, for example. And many of our student representatives indicated to us that they preferred that method rather than the traditional in-person approaches. They felt that there were more, they felt they were able to engage with the staff on more of a level playing field, for example. We can see that the digital environment facilitates quick checking and sharing of views, and physical barriers are removed. We heard from some staff that they were able to meet with colleagues that they perhaps hadn't seen for many years, or that they weren't accustomed to being able to catch up with really quickly because the physical distance was removed. I know Frederick was talking about the number of keynotes you've been able to deliver. I can. This morning, I was talking to a group of colleagues from right across the UK. Today, I'm talking to you, some of you based in Morocco. So, that's something that I couldn't have done, or couldn't have achieved in one day without the aid of digital technology. So there are benefits as well. Within QAA, we engaged in a lot of very quick production of guidance and advice to support our member institutions. And I'm going to talk to you about sort of two main things. We were interested in looking at the kinds of practice in digital learning, teaching and assessment that were actually associated with improved student engagement and progression and achievement. And we also engaged in a range of discussions looking at how we could support students to be involved in thinking about quality, academic standards, and also thinking about value. And we knew that there were, while some of that I've just talked about the very positive feedback we had from student reps, we also know there were an awful lot of students at a thoroughly miserable time. They were very isolated socially, they were very concerned about what was going to happen, and they couldn't meet their friends regularly, and particularly if they also were experiencing digital poverty, then it was a pretty awful time for them. And so we heard lots of reports of students being extremely dissatisfied with their university education. And what we wanted to be able to do was disentangle the different types of feedback we were getting. So disentangle the feedback we were getting from students that was actually related to the wider situation of the pandemic from those parts of feedback that were very much about their learning and teaching, or were very much about their educational experience. So moving on, we conducted a really large-scale project which ran over both years of the pandemic and concluded just at the end of last academic year. And what we were interested in were the kinds of practices that were associated with improving student engagement. And we looked at, and again, my slides will be available to you, so I'm not going to go through every one of these bullet points. But we engaged with a company called Shift, who helped us to conduct some research with a wide range of academic staff with different sorts of roles, from senior managers to the teachers who were directly involved in what we might have thought of as a classroom, whether that's a physical one or a digital one. And virtually all of them were agreed that there had been a massive impact on student engagement, but they were quite divided over whether that impact had been positive or negative. And very often we found that the split depended on the characteristics of the students, either their personal characteristics, or, for example, students who had disabilities were quite often felt that they had benefits from being taught in a digital space, whereas younger students who were moving, who were more likely to be closer to having moved from school into higher education, were more likely to feel that their education had been negatively impacted on it. But some of the characteristics were more about the mode of learning. So we found that there was a difference between part-time and full-time students, all of that kind of thing. So not necessarily personal characteristics, but some of them about learning characteristics as well. What we were really interested in looking at was the kinds of activities that were going to improve student engagement. So here are some of the outcomes, or one set of outcomes. And in this, we were looking at asynchronous resources, so the kinds of asynchronous activities that could be offered to students in a digital or hybrid space. And we were interested in what were the kinds of things that were most closely associated or most likely to help support greater student engagement. And you can see here that lecture recordings and materials that students could work on in their own time had the biggest impact, followed by interactive quizzes and games that could be offered, and then thirdly, structured video content. I'm going to move on quickly in the interest of time. Compared with engagement in asynchronous learning, live engagement with live sessions was massively impacted by the rapid shift to digital. So around just over half of those surveyed concluded that actually their student engagement in live sessions had decreased as a result of this shift into the digital space. And this is important learning, just as other colleagues were saying. It's important for us to really analyse what went on in the pandemic so we can design better approaches into the future. So, and this disengagement with live learning and teaching activity is something that a number of our institutions are continuing to report, even in this academic year, where there has been, or there is able to be, a return to campus. We are seeing students back on the campuses, we're seeing them back in physical spaces, but many institutions are reporting that actually attendance at physical in-person lectures is still not back at the pre-pandemic level, which is interesting. So in our study, we were interested in looking at the kinds of synchronous or live activities that were most likely to encourage students to engage. And you can see again, so opportunities to interact live with members of staff, opportunities to interact with live Q&A sessions, and then some of the other materials that students might be able to listen to either live and then play back later. Interestingly, opportunities to interact with peers wasn't particularly associated with improved engagement. It was a bit, but not as much as those other opportunities there that we can see. We were also interested in the impact of assessment practices and assessment design that were associated with improved achievement. And we saw that of those staff that we surveyed, 38% felt that the changes had improved grades and 16% said they'd resulted in lowering grades. We also saw very positive feedback that the shift to digital had a positive impact on students' digital capabilities, and therefore with potential positive knock-on consequences for the employability of those students, which is interesting. Moving on, again, conscious of time, coming out of the pandemic, these were, so views of the experience of those 2 years of the emergency pivot. And it's interesting to reflect on those practices. What we get asked very often is, what does good look like? What does good practice look like in a digital or hybrid space? And so within the QAA, my agency, we created a series of what we called hallmarks of success. So a series of playbooks that looked at, well, what does good look like in a digital and blended space? And the playbooks focused on 4 different aspects: assessment, course design, approval and management, student-centred learning and teaching, and the final one was looking at supporting and empowering teaching staff. Finally, or penultimately, we've also supported a range of what we call collaborative enhancement projects to allow groups of institutions to work together. And finally, just to identify some of the challenges, some of which colleagues have identified already. We really need to dig into the issues of accessibility and equivalence. So thinking about challenges of digital poverty, how do we get over that if we're going to continue to deliver in a digital or hybrid space? Thinking about how we can induct students. So how can we help students to understand what the culture is like in an institution if they either haven't experienced it before or they're only intermittently experiencing it because they're not fully on campus with other students in the way that traditionally they might have been. And creating that sense of belonging for all of our students, making sure that every student feels that they have a right to be at the institution, this is their institution, and that they have a right and agency over the kinds of experience that they have. And finally, to really make sure that there is proper support in place for the staff who are delivering and designing the courses, because they too have a very large, well, they too are humans and we need to have a duty of care for them, but also they have a very important impact on supporting students. I'm going to stop there, but thanks very much indeed for your attention, and I'll look forward to the opportunity for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsa Kron, from your interesting presentation, which focuses on opportunities for evaluation, the future of digital and blended delivery, and digital pedagogy associated with positive student engagement. So ends this first session. Thank you all for your excellent contribution to our conference, and stay connected as the next session starts after 20 minutes. Goodbye. Thank you so much.